Hello everyone, and welcome back to JAS Reviews. Now we are done with list season finally, and now I am going to move on to my normal types of videos. And today we're going to be starting off with another episode of The Critical Corner, my recurring series on this channel. If you are new to the channel, first of all, welcome, but second of all, The Critical Corner is a recurring series on my channel where I do reviews in shorter form of either all movies or all music. And today we are continuing on with movies. We will be going back into the world of music very soon, but there are a lot of movies that I have seen, both old and new, that I wanted to talk about. But we've got 6 movies to talk about, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started with our first one.
I heard that speech. I knew we'd make noise. I just thought it'd be in the streets.
Wow, talk about an impressive movie. I mean, there's just not much I could say about Judas and the Black Messiah that probably hasn't already been said this year, but I'm going to go ahead and add on to the heaps of praise that this movie has deservedly gotten. Now, if you haven't seen this movie or aren't familiar with what it is based on the true story of the Black Panther Fred Hampton and his journey in heading the Black Panther political party and him trying to essentially put people of color in power and break down the structures of oppression and racism that have been in place in America for years. And it's such a powerful movie, and the way it depicts these struggles and the way it so vibrantly depicts Fred Hampton's life. This movie makes you feel the tragedy of Fred Hampton's life being lost. The way it frames the story is really unique, because even though Daniel Kaluuya as Fred Hampton is the technical star of the movie, I would actually say the movie focuses a bit more on Lakeith Stanford's character, Bill O'Neill, who is revealed to be working for the FBI and essentially is informing them on all the activities that the Panthers and Fred Hampton are doing. He's undercover. And of course, his character is pretty despicable in that matter. I mean, Lakeith Stanfield is just such a marvelous actor. He is one of the best actors alive right now. One of the best new actors right now for sure. I mean, man, the guy can just transform himself in every role he puts in. And this might be his best role to date, which is saying quite a bit considering the types of roles he's played in the past and just how good of an actor he's in general. But Lakeith Stanfield should not be the only actor that gets a mention here. Daniel Kaluuya is excellent as Fred Hampton. I mean, that shouldn't be a surprise, because like Lakeith Stanfield, Daniel Kaluuya is an excellent actor. And these two have been in a movie before, of course, and Get Out, so it's no surprise that this director, Shaka King, wanted to put them together in this movie because they work off each other so well. You can just feel the tension and the chemistry between them, and Daniel Kaluuya just disappears into his role of Fred Hampton. There was a video at the end that showed the real-life Fred Hampton, and I think Daniel Kaluuya did a very good job of respectfully embodying who this character was. Also, Jesse Plemons, one of the most underrated actors working right now in my opinion. He is also excellent in this movie. I mean, the 3 leads in this movie all are great. Jesse Plemons plays the main antagonist, the FBI informant Roy Mitchell, and he is so menacing in this movie, and he really makes you feel chills up your spine with what he's doing. He plays this character almost too well. Jesse Plemons is just so good at playing these very despicable characters while also giving them an uncomfortable degree of humanity that almost makes you feel for them, but just when you're about to, you remember that they are the enemy or that they are doing something that is just unbelievably wrong. And this movie should not go without mentioning Shaka King. Man, talk about quite a statement for a big budget directorial debut like this. This was quite the note to introduce us on, and man, this guy he was great at directing this film, gave it so much life and passion and energy. You could feel that he cared about this character and these stories of the other characters besides Fred Hampton. He does a good job, like I said, of balancing between celebrating and mourning the life of Fred Hampton. And he does a good job between balancing the sense of accomplishment in things that Fred did while he was alive, but the sense of anger at how little things have really changed for minorities in America. And it shouldn't go without saying that his directorial style in this film is great too. The church scene in this movie alone, which was shown in the trailer, is one of the best filmed scenes I've seen in quite some time. It is just perfectly done. There's honestly not that many problems I have with this film. If there was one issue, I would say that it almost ended a little too early, and I would have liked to have known a little bit more about some of the other Black Panther characters, even though I do know that this movie was focused on Fred Hampton. And honestly, in some ways, I would have liked to have known even more about Fred Hampton as a person. This movie does focus on Bill O'Neill, and I think that's a fine choice, in fact, a great one. But I think I would have liked to have known even more about Fred and who he was as a person. Judas and the Black Messiah is undoubtedly going to be one of my favorite films of 2021. This was a superb release. I have been looking forward to this movie since 2020, and the pandemic delayed it, so I'm so glad I finally saw this, and it is so worth it. Please watch this film.
You are by far the most excruciating, difficult, stubbornly obnoxious woman I've ever met in my entire life.
Malcolm and Marie is yet another quarantine film made around the subject of quarantine and of being isolated, and this one was actually made during the time of COVID as well, so it's sort of fitting in that regard. Malcolm and Marie is made by Sam Levinson, known as the director of the movie Assassination Nation, and also the creator of the TV show Euphoria. Now, I've never really seen Assassination Nation, but I have watched Euphoria, and I think it's a pretty good show. There are a couple of problems I have with it, like sometimes it's almost too overdramatic, and sometimes certain characters, especially Zendaya's character Rue, are a little pretentious, but that doesn't really matter too much when the story is still pretty compelling, and I think Sam Levinson does a good job at capturing the vulnerabilities of teenagers in high school. I do wish I liked this movie more. I have quite a few problems with this, and I feel sort of complicated on it at the end of the day. Malcolm and Marie is, of course, about the couple, Malcolm and Marie, and they're coming home from Malcolm's movie premiere, his directorial debut film, and they are essentially waiting to hear reviews of the film. But Malcolm is feeling optimistic. He feels that the movie went well and the audience was receiving it well. But Marie doesn't seem so impressed with the reception, and she eventually asks the question, why didn't Malcolm cast her as a role? Or was Malcolm's lead role in the film based on her? And that ignites into this whole huge argument that dominates pretty much the entire movie. Yeah, this movie is basically one big argument, and that is probably the biggest issue with it. It feels like the characters are just angry at each other. There's not much other emotions they express. There are brief moments of happiness, brief moments where they're happy with each other, but those moments barely last before they're going at it with each other again. I see what Sam Levinson was going for. He was trying to make a very contained story and actually reveal character traits of both Malcolm and Marie through this argument and who they were as people. But I can't help that both characters feel like cardboard cutouts, especially Malcolm. When I got later into this movie, I sort of realized what it was going to be, and it turned very pretentious. Sam Levinson gave into his worst intentions and his worst habits that he has sometimes expressed in Euphoria, but they come out in full force here. There's this scene in this movie where Malcolm is getting a critic review for his movie, and he reads the review, or rather Marie reads the review, and it's actually a positive review. But Malcolm breaks down in anger over it, and this character is an African American, and he goes into this tirade about whether all films made by Black people should be about race or should be about politics or things like that. And it's just a little weird, I feel like, for Sam Levinson to be the one saying these things, because he's white. I don't want to get too much into it, because the scene is really uncomfortable to me more than anything else, and it does feel really pretentious. It feels like Sam Levinson is going on a tirade against critics and calling their opinions invalid. And this is basically a real-life tirade from him. This is where I realized that Malcolm was essentially based on him. Now, stylistically, this movie is actually pretty decent. I do like the black and white on it, although I'm not sure if it was necessary, but I do think it gave room for some stylistic and interesting shots. Although I once again have to say, I don't feel like the stylistic shots added much to the movie. It just felt like they were there for a reason. And the way that Sam Levinson uses the space in this film It feels very unnatural. Overall, Malcolm and Marie just isn't that great of a movie, and it feels like Sam Levinson was trying to insert his personality into these two characters, and I'm just not sure it worked at the end of the day. 2.5 out of 5 stars for me. I just didn't care for this that much.
You knew him, didn't you? Then you had that one little feeling. But you waved it away.
The Little Things is directed by John Lee Hancock and is about police detective Joe Deacon, who goes to this town to search for some pretty generic evidence. It doesn't seem like a big deal, but then he gets involved in tracking down a serial killer, and eventually he realizes that the serial killer that he's hunting down is someone that he's had a personal connection with in the past. He teams up with the younger cop Jim Baxter, who has become the head of the police department he's at, and he's very enthusiastic about finding the serial killer, and together they hunt him down. This movie is interesting, but I'm not sure that it really does what it wants to do as well as it could. I think the thing that lifts this movie up more than anything is the excellent two lead performances. Denzel Washington as Deacon is great. Denzel is still charming as ever, even when he's playing a role that I feel is a little monotoned and a little less charming for him. I still think he does very well, and he shows the vulnerabilities and the insecurities of this character well. And he has the most compelling things going on, especially as we're discovering that he's haunted by a past case that has to do with the serial killer he's hunting down. And the way that Hancock reveals what happened in this previous time with the serial killer, the brief snippets, and the way the mystery builds up is actually pretty interesting. And I almost wish that the movie had been focusing on that rather than the present story that it actually does, because the past story with Deacon is actually a little more compelling and could give Deacon a bit more of a complicated character arc, I feel like. Rami Malek is probably my favorite performance here as Jim Baxter. I think I just have a bias to Malek at this point. I won't deny it. Some people weren't impressed by his performance, and I suppose I can understand why, but I think he did a great job in this movie, playing up the increasing paranoia of this character as he keeps on ramping up and keeps on questioning everything around him. And it's just pretty sad what happens to this cop and how he eventually loses seemingly faith in humanity over the course of the movie. Unfortunately, the serial killer is where we get to the problems of this movie. And yeah, when your antagonist is the biggest problem of the movie, that's going to make the movie suffer. Jared Leto, this guy is just not my thing. I can't stand him, honestly, as an actor anymore. In this movie, he plays the serial killer Albert Sparma, and his performance just isn't that interesting. It feels like a sort of toned-down Joker performance. It's like Leto is playing the Joker again, except it's not as bad, I suppose, but it's still quite mediocre, and we don't even really see this character do anything. He's not very menacing for a serial killer character. He doesn't even commit any violence or any crimes or anything in the movie. He's just going around driving a car. And what we really got was a very generic police procedural with, I suppose, some things we could call character development, but there's far better character studies out there now. Honestly, this movie feels outdated, if anything else. 3 out of 5 stars for me. I didn't care for this one that much. It was okay, I suppose, but it's not one that I would necessarily recommend.
Erica, you haven't ever wished family would adopt you, have you? Nope. Anybody who'd choose me would...
Come on, Studio Ghibli, what is this? I mean, when I saw the trailers for this movie, I was already very skeptical. Studio Ghibli doing their first CGI film and it looking about as amateur as some of the CGI ripoff films we get from other studios who are actually cheap. Studio Ghibli has made some of the best animated films of all time. Spirited Away is one of my top 10 favorite movies. Now, this is made by Miyazaki's son, Goro Miyazaki, and it's based around this orphan girl named Earwig who was dropped off at an orphanage by a witch. And this witch has some interesting powers, I'll admit, but we don't see much of her at all in the movie. And Earwig is sent to this human orphanage where there aren't any, like, magical people, and eventually she gets adopted by this other witch who takes her on as basically a slave. There's not much else to say about it. She's basically child labor. She does work for the witch, and the witch promises her that she'll teach her some spells, but she never does. And so Earwig is eventually trying to find a way to either get out of the house or to get the witch to do what she wants. Yeah, a pretty thin plot, right? And it is as thin as it sounds. The movie is only an hour and 22 minutes, and part of that is the credits. So this movie only ends up being about 70 to 75-ish minutes. It is a very short film, and it does feel like it goes by very fast. And there's barely anything that happens in it. Earwig as a character is a huge problem here. She's not likable, not at all. Now, I am fine with a character being unlikable for a time, but Earwig just is not compelling. She's not fun to watch. And the way she treats the people around her isn't remotely sympathetic. It doesn't even make sense why she does, really. Now, I sort of see what Goro Miyazaki was going for with this character, that she was trying to get people to do what she wanted because she'd felt so lonely all her life, and the only way maybe that she could get acceptance was by acting like something she wasn't. Maybe that's the way she thought she could get acceptance. But the problem is that this character never really learns the lesson that she doesn't have to do that. It also doesn't help that most of the other characters aren't likable here either. The only character that is remotely likable is Earwig's friend Custard. The witch is a snob and very unlikable, and all she does is make Earwig work. And there's nothing else to her character. Same goes with the Mandrake. He has, I suppose, a couple more compelling things going on, but his character is just constantly demanding things out of Earwig and out of the witch, and all the characters come together to make a very unlikable centering of the movie. The most frustrating thing about this movie is just when it seems it's starting to get interesting, when there's this big reveal, the movie just ends. Just like that. It seems like it got to barely past the first act, and it's getting to this climactic moment, but then it ends when the climax happens. It's not a complete story. It doesn't feel like it at all. The animation is so bad in this. I don't want to harp on it too much because it's obvious. I mean, you can tell in every shot in this movie that the animation is just amateur, especially compared to the quality of work that Studio Ghibli has produced in the past. This is a huge downgrade, and I feel like Hayao Miyazaki would be rolling over in his grave if he knew this was happening. 2 out of 5 stars for this movie. Very, very disappointing. Only a couple of decent elements here. I guess some of the animation looked okay in some places, and there were some cool moments in the movie, but overall, it didn't work for me at all.
Dear God, your presence graces the air, and soon everyone will see.
Well, now it's time to talk about a better movie and A24's newest film, Saint Maud. And this centers around Maud, who is a nurse that works with people who are dying in their homes. And she has recently converted to Catholicism, which is a very important point to remember. And in this movie, she's working with a woman named Amanda, who has recently gotten cancer and is slowly dying from it. She used to be a dancer, but she can't do it anymore. And the movie is partly about their budding relationship and how Maud almost seems to form an attraction to her. But while this is going on, she's also feeling complications with her religion and with what God is telling her to do. But there's a huge question. Is Maud talking to God at all, or is something else talking to her? Now, as far as A24 movies go, I wouldn't say this is in the top tier of them, but this is still a great film, and it shows once again that A24 is one of the most reliable movie studios out there right now. I feel like this one should be more of a crowd pleaser, so it has surprised me that this one got a bit more of a mixed reception than I was expecting. Maybe it's because of the slightly quick ending, which I will admit was a little too quick for me as well, but I did sort of like the quick impact it had and how it had this immediate horror moment that actually sent chills up my spine. This movie has a lot of tension and a lot of good buildup in it. There is so much drenching atmosphere in this movie, and it is really interesting. And that mainly comes from Maud, played excellently by Morfydd Clark. Her performance in this movie is just magnetic. You are endlessly attached to this character, and you're constantly scared by her because you're not sure what she's going to end up doing to Amanda or even to herself because of her absolute religious fanaticism. Yeah, this movie is simply great. There's a lot to like about it. The scares are good, the tension is beautiful, and the score is just wonderful. One of the best scores I've heard in horror in quite some time. It really lifts this movie to new heights. 3.5 out of 5 stars for this one. This was a fun watch. Really good horror film that I think is worth your time. You should check it out.
Largin Song Covey, will you go to prom with me?
Yes, of course.
And finally, we have what I think is the last movie in the To All the Boys trilogy. This one is called Always and Forever. And if you've been on my channel for a while, then you may have seen what was, I believe, my second episode of the Critical Corner, where I talked about the second To All the Boys movie. And I'm just going to reiterate my thoughts on that one as well as the first one. Now, as far as the first one goes, I actually think this is a really good movie. This one was a pleasant surprise. The first one really surprised me in a good way. I didn't think I'd like it, and honestly, rom-coms are not usually that my thing. They're one of my least favorite genres of film, but when a rom-com impresses me, it really impresses me usually, and this one really did impress me. I thought it did a good job of reinventing some of the tropes of especially the teen rom-com genre, and made it actually pretty charming. Now, as far as the second movie went, that one really did disappoint me. It wasn't terrible by any means, but it went for this love triangle story that I really just didn't like. I just don't care about love triangle stories and rom-coms. And also, I feel like this movie had the problem of not making you root for Laura Jean and Peter's romance. The characters felt very unlikable here, both of them, especially Peter, and I just didn't like them together in this movie. It was very weird, because I liked them together in the first one, so it was sort of a problem that I wasn't necessarily rooting for them to be together in the second movie when that's what they were wanting you to do. Now, once again, this movie isn't anything special, but I do think it's better than the second one. Not by a significant mile, but it is better. Thankfully, this one has no love triangle elements. Instead, this one is focusing on the fact that Laura Jean is getting ready to graduate high school and move on to college, and her and Peter are trying to essentially go to the same college together, but Laura does not get accepted to the college that Peter did, and so she eventually has to decide what she wants to do with her life. Does she want to go to a college that's an hour away, or does she want to go to New York University, which she becomes very attracted to on a senior trip in New York? Now, I do think this premise is a lot more interesting than the second movie, and the way the movie frames it, I think it does have some genuine weight to it. And while I've not been in a relationship like this before, I can relate to the feeling of not being sure what college you want to go to and how far away you want to be from the people you care about the most. And I think Lana Condor does a good job at portraying these emotions. She is once again very charming in this movie, and she is very fun to watch, and I still think she's a very sympathetic character. She does great in this movie, and it was still fun to follow along with her. I also think Noah Centineo was pretty good in this movie as Peter. In fact, I think this might be his best performance in the 3 films. He has a lot more weighty stuff to work with in this movie, especially as the movie starts to focus on him trying to rebuild his relationship with his father who left him when he was young. Ross Butler and Madeline Arthur are also both good in this movie as Trevor and Chris. I've always really liked them in these movies. I think they're actually pretty strong performers, and I would have liked to have seen them in slightly more prominent roles in the movie. And yeah, I think that's what this movie has going most for it, is it is pretty charming, especially as it focuses on Laura Jean's dad getting remarried again since her mom died when she was very young, and it's just sort of nice that it focuses on like new types of love and things like that, and I think it is pretty genuine. Its celebration of love does feel well earned. There are, however, still some problems with this film. First of all, like with the second one, I feel like the music does too much in this film. I feel like it is used way too much and relied on too much to give the emotion. Now, like I said in my review of the second movie, I have no problem with music being used as emotion in a film. I think it can be a good thing, but I feel like both the second and this movie use it way too much. Now, a couple of musical montages I could understand. I think the first one did a pretty good job in balancing this out, and I think the other 2 movies have tried to replicate that style again because it was pretty unique, but they just haven't been able to do it in the same way. Also, another problem with this movie is I didn't necessarily care for its ending entirely. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. There were some aspects of the ending that I was okay with, but there were also some aspects that I just thought were really unrealistic and ultimately idealistic. What they do with Laura Jean and Peter's relationship just didn't feel real to me. They were going one way with the story that I was actually really into, and it seemed like they were going to keep going that way, and I sort of liked that, but then they go back on it, and they go back to the route that pretty much all rom-coms do, and you know what I'm talking about if you've seen the movie or if you've seen any rom-com. Still, To All the Boys, Always and Forever was a decent movie, and I mean, these three movies are harmless, and I can understand why the primary demographic likes them. I'll admit, I am not the primary demographic for these movies, but the fact that I was even able to enjoy them at all, in part, especially the first one, is a significant testament to the director's talent. She was able to make something that I think was pretty crowd-pleasing and something that isn't offensive to watch. It's not necessarily the most cliched rom-com out there, even if it does have a lot of cliches in it, and I do think the ending of this trilogy is sort of cliche. There's still some genuine moments in here, and I ultimately stayed for the performance of Lana Condor. I think that's worth the price of admission alone. 3 out of 5 stars for this one. I did like this movie, but it wasn't great or anything like that. Just pretty good. So yeah, that ends my latest episode of The Critical Corner. What were your thoughts on any of the movies I talked about? Let me know in the comments down below. Once again, my name is James, and I do reviews of both music and movies on this channel. So give this video a like if you enjoyed what I was doing. And I should have a music review coming very soon, and it's one I'm very excited to talk about. So be on the lookout for that very soon. And until then, I will see you all in the next video.